Greetings, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'll be waiting just a minute or two for additional folks to join us, and then we'll get started. So I think we will now go ahead and get started, and allow me to begin by welcoming you all to this high-level session of the 2021 Geneva Dialogues on Human Rights and Climate Change, addressing the question, what role for human rights institutions in supporting the rights-based implementation of the Paris Agreement in 2021 and beyond? My name is Ben Schachter. I lead the Environment and Climate Change team at the United Nations Human Rights Office. We're pleased to have co-organized this latest edition of the Geneva Dialogues with the Center for International Environmental Law, Earth Justice, and Natural Justice, as well as the generous support of the government of Luxembourg and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Foundation. The Geneva Dialogues on Human Rights and Climate Change create an opportunity for in-depth discussion of what is widely recognized as one of the most important human rights challenges of our times. This year, as we adjusted to the reality of COVID-19 pandemic, we were able to bring many new voices from the world beyond Geneva into the conversations through a new virtual format. We explored concrete ways in which United Nations human rights mechanisms, including special procedures, treaty bodies, the Universal Periodic Review, and the Human Rights Council, as well as regional bodies and national human rights institutions, can address specific dimensions of the human rights crisis induced by climate change and support state action in this area. This year presents a critical and perhaps final opportunity to meaningfully address climate change in a way that will minimize its harmful human rights impacts. States must drastically increase the ambition of their climate commitments under the Paris Agreement. They must mobilize adequate finance for action in line with their common but differentiated responsibilities. And they must ensure participation, safeguards, and redress are part of climate action. As we work to build sufficient ambition and political will to ensure these rights-based climate solutions at COP26, human rights institutions have a key role to play. Through interaction with states, jurisprudence, human rights reporting, and interpretation of the law, UN regional and national human rights mechanisms and institutions are already making essential contributions in support of climate action that leaves no one behind. In the workshops already held as part of the Geneva Dialogues, we explored ways in which human rights bodies can advance human rights-based climate action around three key themes: environmental justice, land rights, and providing redress for climate harms. You'll be hearing more about these workshops in the discussion that follows. We're grateful to all of those of you who've joined us today for the closing of these dialogues and to those who contributed to the preceding discussions. Before I finish, I'd like to remind everybody that interpretation is available in French and Spanish, and to please use the Q&A chat to share questions and comments. I very much look forward to your discussions and would like to now invite our moderator, Ms. Diana Rizzolio from the Geneva Environment Network, to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Ben, for introducing the event and for our hosts today. May I bring to the attention of our attendees that the titles and biographies of today's session speakers are or will be available in the chat box of this event, where you can also raise your questions, as Ben just mentioned, that we will address in the Q&A session of this event. The event today is structured in two core parts before we move to the concluding remarks. We will start with a high-level segment and follow with an expert panel. And we will also, before the closure session, address with our guests the questions raised in the Q&A box throughout the event. Behind the scenes, we have various colleagues from the institutions convening this event and the interpreters. May I remind all our speakers to not speak too fast to allow the interpreters to be efficient with the translations. And as Ben just mentioned, interpretation is available in Spanish and French. Moving on with our agenda, we are now starting the high-level segment, and it is our pleasure to give the floor on behalf of our hosts today to Her Excellency Carole Dieschbourg, the Minister for the Environment, Climate and Sustainable Development of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. Her Excellency will introduce you to the Geneva dialogues and why it is important to discuss the role of human rights in climate action this year, including the expectations of Luxembourg in the context of climate ambition and how human rights institutions support these agendas. It is a pre-recorded video message, and I'm kindly asking the colleagues working behind the scenes to launch the video. We have some sound issues. Sorry for the technical problems.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues. It's my honor today to welcome you all to the 21 Human Rights and Climate Change Geneva Dialogues. As we gather today, virtually, the world is in crisis. COVID-19 has uncovered many vulnerabilities in our societies and economies and has stripped us from many important aspects on our life that we value as human beings, such as in-person meetings with our families, friends, colleagues, entertainment or culture. In addition, the actual COVID-19 situation reminds us how closely our environment and our well-being are linked. But COVID-19 is not the only crisis that we are facing. It is clear, long before its emergence, that we also find ourselves in a climate crisis, which includes unprecedented biodiversity loss and destruction of natural habitat, as well as non-sustainable use of resources that threaten our environment and health. These key aspects are of the very foundation of our societies. The climate crisis is still very much a reality, and it is worsening. Taking the impact of the COVID-19 on our life into account, it is clear that we must rebuild better and more resiliently. And the rebuilding starts now, in 2021, as we slowly find our way out of the COVID crisis. In other words, there is no vaccine against the effects of climate change or climate crisis itself. We need to raise our ambition and actions in order to address those challenges as they represent a global threat to security, to our safety, and to peace. And also, they reinforce inequalities. But we need to adopt a holistic approach in order to build a more resilient, a safer and fairer world for all of us. Consequently, the promotion and protection of human rights and gender equality in the context of climate action is crucial, and not integrating them would be not in our best interest. let us seize the opportunity to create an inclusive and equal society in harmony with nature and our planet. It is in this spirit that Luxembourg, for the first time, has presented its candidacy to the UN Human Rights Council for 2022 to 2024, therewith showing our strong commitment to the promotion and the protection of human rights and its implementation in both domestic and foreign policy across all thematic issues. The fight against climate change and the fight for more human rights are intrinsically linked. Also, one of Luxembourg's priorities on the Human Rights Council would be a rights-based approach to sustainable development and climate action. In Luxembourg, we see 2021 as a pivotal year for climate change. At the end of last year, just ahead the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement, Luxembourg adopted its first national climate law, which has been designed in line with the Paris Agreement and provides the legal framework for the National Climate and Energy Plan. This law opens many opportunities for us. We also are in the process of updating our international climate finance strategy to further reflect human rights, not only gender, rights across the international climate action. Just a few weeks ago, dear ladies and gentlemen, in February 2021, Luxembourg also adopted its first sustainable finance strategy, which will help to further streamline our action as well as help our financial sector to mainstream investments to take care of environmental, social and governance aspects into account, and this at all levels of investment cycle. However, only continuous engagement and exchange with human rights experts, institutions and civil society will enable us to continuously adapt to changing realities, as well as to emerging human rights challenges and questions for various groups at risk. This will help us to adapt our policy actions accordingly. Only recently, at the 46th session of the Human Rights Council, Luxembourg lent its support to joint statements on human rights and the environment, as well as on human rights and climate change. I strongly believe that it's only through this type of engagement and exchange that we will be able to set ourselves up for progress at the COP26 in Glasgow and beyond, and most importantly, to learn from each other in order to design a sustainable and impactful solutions to protect our people from the effects of the climate crisis. These effects range from physical impact on livelihoods to structural injustices of vulnerable groups. It is necessary to make tangible progress on these very sensitive matters, and human rights institutions are an integral part of that progress, both in terms of proactivity and reactivity. Ladies and gentlemen, it's therefore my great honor to have you all together discussing concrete commitment and action that could be achieved in 2021 and beyond to promote human rights-based approach to climate responses and to promote cooperation amongst us all. I'd like to thank the Center for International Environmental Law and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for their continued and strong leadership in this space. I hope Ciel's recently launched reports, Right, Carbon, Caution, upholding human rights under the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement will give the insight needed to fuel good discussions and debate. I would like to conclude with the following. We have a duty to rebuild better, fairer and more resiliently in 2021. We have the duty to seize the opportunity for change. We owe it to the thousands of young people who took their fears and anger with regard to climate change to the streets prior to this pandemic. We owe it to thousands or millions of people who have lost their job as a result of this pandemic and now find themselves in very precarious situation. We owe it to the millions of people globally whose livelihoods are very vulnerable prior to the pandemic but have worsened even now. We owe it to us, to our planet, to the house that supports us every day. Thank you for your attention, and now I wish you a great afternoon and good discussions. Thank you very much.
After having heard this strong commitment and message from Luxembourg, we continue a high-level segment. It is now our pleasure to introduce the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet. The High Commissioner will speak about the importance of addressing human rights in climate action and what are the expectations for the United Nations Climate Change Conference that we refer to as COP26 from a human rights perspective. The High Commissioner has also a pre-recorded intervention that our colleagues will now launch.
I welcome these interesting discussions and thank you for the invitation to participate in this vital event. This is a make or break year to confront the climate emergency, as the UN Secretary General has said. Climate change is an overarching threat to human rights and its impacts are already upon us, all of us. Over the past pandemic year, we have seen the COVID-19 crisis being met with disarray, delays, and disunity. We've also seen the opposite. We have seen extraordinary innovation, many new examples of cooperation across a wide range of sectors, and a fast-moving global efforts to promote vaccines globally for everyone's benefit. In the next year, as we strive to overcome COVID-19, we also must address the even more overwhelming threat of climate change. And we need to move fast. We have to learn the lessons of COVID, including our new understanding of ways that human rights protection gaps act as conduits and multipliers of disasters, and our grasp of the human rights-based policies that work to combat crises that impact the entire globe. And we need to apply those lessons to climate change. Human rights are the key to devising climate policies that are equitable, inclusive, and effective. This is why my office recently joined 14 other UN entities in calling for global recognition of the human rights to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. This right, recognized by more than 150 states, empowers individuals and communities to press for and participate in actions to ensure a safe and stable climate. Human rights mechanisms have a critical role in ensuring human rights-based climate action. In 2020, the UN Human Rights Mechanism issued 181 recommendations or observations related to climate change or the environment. Recommendations issued during UPR reviews at the Human Rights Council are often explicitly supported by the countries concerned. In 2020, this was the case of 49 of the 51 UPR recommendations targeted to climate issues, helping to build and strengthen their determination to act. Guidance from human rights experts helps states to analyze the detailed human consequences of climate policies on specific population groups, notably those whose concerns are often marginalized or neglected. Like my office, expert mechanism can also make significant contributions to law and policy. In 2018, the Human Rights Committee's General Comment 36 on the right to life was cited in the path-breaking Urgenda climate litigation in the Netherlands, and in 2020, the contributions of the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment were influential in the Friends of the Irish Environment case in Ireland. The Human Rights Committee's recent recognition that climate change may trigger non-refoulement obligations builds upon an evolving understanding of the severity of the human rights impacts of climate change and the need to establish durable legal pathways for the migration with dignity of those worst affected. But the most effective environmental actions are those that include and are led by the people who are most affected. I pay tribute to the activism of indigenous peoples, men and women, environmental human rights defenders, and youth movements that are calling attention to the unjust and disproportionate effects of the climate emergency and working to preserve human rights. These voices must be more than present in the run-up to COP26. They must be prominent and even preeminent. The structure and substance of climate negotiations should embody a participatory, human rights-based approach, and we must find an equitable solution to the challenge that unequal vaccine access poses for in-person negotiations. I am convinced that we can come to COP26 with a new, stronger understanding of what exactly is at stake. Because in terms of death, economic damage and extreme poverty, social tensions and violence, displacement, and the potential impact on conflict and profound underdevelopment, the damage that climate change will or could inflict is far greater even than COVID-19 and over a much longer period. So we have an unmissable opportunity this year to meaningfully tackle these issues. We need to secure climate justice, including by addressing gender inequality, intergenerational inequity, and environmental racism. We need detailed, concrete, concerted, ambitious action to limit average global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. We have learned that we can do this. We have learned that we must do this. And we have learned how we must do this by putting human rights at the center of climate action.
Sorry. Things happen when they shouldn't be happening. Sorry. We will now continue our high-level segment with, and it's our pleasure to turn to His Excellency Bruce Billimon, the Acting Minister in Assistant to the President and Minister of Environment of the Republic of the Marshall Islands. We will hear from His Excellency why it is important to integrate human rights in climate action from a small island developing state perspective, and what are the outcomes from COP26 that His Excellency would like to see in a new pre-recorded message. This is our last pre-recorded message in this event.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, greetings and Yahweh from the Republic of the Marshall Islands. I would like to start by thanking the organizers of this event for bringing us together to talk about the important topic of human rights and climate change. The impact of climate change on human rights has been discussed at the Human Rights Council as far as 2008. In 2015, the landmark Paris Agreement declared that when taking action to address climate change, parties should respect, promote, and consider their respective obligations on human rights. And in 2019, High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet recognized that climate change is the greatest threat to human rights. And yet, despite the gravity of this issue, we see the link between human rights and climate change being downplayed, relegated to preambles, and all too often absent from climate change, environment, and disaster-related discussions at the high level. Meanwhile, here in my country, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, we are seeing first an acceleration of our coastal erosion due to sea level rise, leading to displacement of some members of our community. We are also experiencing an unprecedented number of droughts and extreme weather events, which continue to constrain our already limited resources. We are not responsible for this unfortunate situation. Our share of global greenhouse gas emissions makes up only 0.00001% of the world's contributions. But as a government, we have a responsibility to uphold and defend the human rights of our citizens as clearly stipulated by the 1948 Declaration and the UN Charter. That is why we have long been leaders on climate change action. As the first country to submit our updated climate commitment under the Paris Agreement, we have been convening the High Ambition Coalition to continue to press for enhanced climate action, and we recently completed our adaptation communication while we continue to work on our national adaptation plan. In the International Maritime Organization, we just introduced a measure with the Solomon Islands to levy a tax on greenhouse gas emissions. But while we are doing our best to develop our own climate mitigation and adaptation plans, they remain dependent on climate financing and international cooperation. Climate change is a global challenge, and it requires action and support from all countries, particularly the major emitters. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is therefore timely to recall the universality of human rights as stipulated in the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action. Let us remind ourselves that it is our collective responsibility to promote and to protect all human rights and fundamental freedoms everywhere. It is the responsibility of the Human Rights Council to take action when states are not fulfilling their obligations as articulated in the UNGA Resolution 60-251. This is the year for climate action, and countries must arrive at COP26 in Glasgow ready to take ambitious action. In particular, making sure that Article 6 rules ensure environmental integrity and do not undermine the emission reduction goal of the Convention, and that the negotiations around Article 8 aim to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage in relation to disaster displacement. It needs to draw from and ensure coherence with existing relevant frameworks, in particular the Sendai framework and the guiding principles on internal displacement. And at the HRC, we are calling with 53 other countries for the establishment of a special rapporteur on human rights and climate change. And the purpose is to monitor and reaffirm stakeholders' obligations based on core human rights treaties. The rapporteur will also embolden synergies with other climate change processes such as the UNFCCC by promoting the implementation of domestic climate change actions. As a country, we believe these initiatives will ensure that human rights is at the forefront of our collective climate action, thus assuring a brighter future for humanity. Thank you, and kamotata.
Following this new strong message from the Pacific Islands, we will now move to the host of the next climate change negotiations with Archie Young, the United Kingdom lead climate negotiator. Mr. Young, we would like to hear from you what must happen in 2021 to see increased climate ambition, and what role can the upcoming climate change conference, COP26, play to address the current ambition gap? What do you think will be at stake for human rights in Glasgow? And also, how can COP26 support the Paris Agreement commitment for parties to respect, promote, and take into consideration human rights in climate action? Mr. Young, you have 5 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you, Diana, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation, and thank you also to everybody who has participated in the dialogues for all the work that has gone into it. And it's humbling to follow Minister Billimon from such a clear signal of the direction that we need the world to travel in, to keep 1.5 degrees alive and for the health and the security and safety of all people around the world. So I'm Archie Young, as you say. I've been the UK's lead climate negotiator for nearly 5 years now, and hold that role as we prepare as incoming presidency for COP26. I will start by outlining some of our headline goals for COP26 before shining a spotlight on several issues where human rights will be particularly pertinent. Inevitably, in a few minutes, I will not be comprehensive, but I hope you will appreciate that we recognize both the opportunity that inclusive, ambitious climate action brings for strengthening human rights, as well as the need to make sure that actions to tackle climate change are taken forward in a way that upholds them. Now, our broad goals for COP26 are very much aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. Accelerate emissions reductions through nationally determined contributions, commitments to net zero, charting that course to keep 1.5 degrees alive. Second, accelerating adaptation action to help people around the world prepare for and respond to climate impacts, increasing the finance for adaptation, as well as increasing the political importance of it and making sure that initiatives and programs are delivering. And third, finance. We all recognize that the scale of the transition that is required across the world needs more finance of all types, public and private. We need to make sure that donor countries deliver on the 100 billion, but also that we unleash the trillions of private finance that is necessary to enable the transition we all want to see. And fourth, enhanced collaboration, which includes really delivering on the multilateral process, but also recognizing that in order to deliver this transition, we need the input and the action and the voices of actors across the spectrum, whether that be civil society, whether that be businesses, whether that be local, regional governments, institutions, as well as national governments, all playing their part, all working together in a spirit of enhanced collaboration. Now, the context is very challenging. As others have mentioned, COVID has clearly impacted lives and livelihoods. It has impacted institutions and governments. And our sympathy and solidarity is with everyone on this call and beyond. I know that we have all experienced it in different ways, and in many cases, painfully so. But as Minister Dieschbourg said, it also presents an opportunity. It presents an opportunity for a green, resilient recovery. And it is also impressive to see how many countries still have managed to submit new enhanced NDCs. They have managed to make new commitments. They have published adaptation communications. They have continued to deliver practical climate action on the ground, despite all the challenges we've seen. We were very pleased to see many of these commitments highlighted at the Climate Ambition Summit that we organized last year, and we continue to bang the drum for that. Now, the recent NDC synthesis report shows, however, how much more needs to be done. So yes, progress was made, but it was a wake-up call that collectively we need to up our game. We need to have more ambition coming forward, and we are engaging in capitals around the world, encouraging that new enhanced ambition. And let me be clear, when I talk about ambition, I'm talking about ambition on mitigation, adaptation, and on finance. We need ambition on all three. But this isn't just about long-term commitments. This is about making tangible progress as well on the key issues in the negotiations and on practical action. And an example of that I would highlight is next week we will be holding a climate and development ministerial, which will focus on practical action that can be taken primarily between now and COP26 on access to finance, on responding to climate impacts, on the quantity, quality, and composition of climate finance, and all these issues which are so important to the most vulnerable around the world. We need to make sure that collectively we are delivering on what we have agreed. Now, we agreed that, of course, in the Paris Agreement, as well as previously in the Convention and since in subsequent decisions. But really, the Paris Agreement did mark that historic turning point on action. And it's clear, as many have commented, and as you know very well, it's clearly stressed in the preamble that respecting and promoting our human rights is fundamental to effective Paris implementation. So for COP26, we do need to ensure that human rights is that underpinning cross-cutting consideration, whether that is in the formation of new ambitious commitments and NDCs, or whether that be in the negotiations. And one particular example I'd highlight, as mentioned by Minister Billimon, but also as referenced and commented on by many of your organizations, the Article 6 negotiations. It's crucial that we do finalize the Paris rulebook, and Article 6 is central to that. Now, as we know, climate change provides challenges, though, for the achievement of legal obligations. And as we know, women, girls, indigenous peoples, and other voices are too often marginalized and are disproportionately impacted by climate change. But also they are the critical agents of change and leaders within the climate response. So one of the things we really want to be able to promote is that sustained and meaningful engagement. And I think that this will ensure that the human rights implications of these often excluded and marginalized groups are amplified through the COP process. Each party should incorporate those considerations into the position that they bring to the negotiation table and in the commitments that they make in their national commitments. And parties will need to continue to uphold human rights principles in their actions. That's why we've been very clear in our commitments to championing inclusivity in our COP26 presidency. We cannot tackle climate change effectively without ensuring inclusion is placed front and center in that climate action. In our position of incoming COP presidency, we recognize we have an important platform for that. We are trying to amplify the voices of those who are often most marginalized, empowering their voices and solutions, not as simply as members of panels, but actually as decision makers, as advocates and as leaders. I'd highlight, for example, indigenous peoples as stewards of 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. They are leaders in how to develop nature-based, resilient, and effective solutions to climate change. So that recognition and affirmation of the rights of indigenous peoples in climate action is crucial. And we're engaging regularly with leaders from indigenous peoples communities to integrate their perspectives into COP planning. We also welcome the result from COP25 on the work plan on the local communities and indigenous peoples platform. We've also heard from many countries that the upcoming renegotiation of the Doha Work Programme on Action for Climate Empowerment represents an important opportunity to draw links between human rights and climate change. And that is because ensuring that our citizens are fully informed and empowered as per our human rights obligations is vital if we are to deliver effective action. We also want to see all countries stepping up their commitments to center gender equality in climate action. And that means using the UNFCCC Gender Action Plan as a guiding tool for how to implement gender responsive climate policies and finance. And we are fully committed to implementing and facilitating that plan as agreed at COP25, and we call on all others to do so. So there are so many more steps that we can take. And I was really pleased that through some of the issues that I've mentioned so far, that there are strong references to human rights in those, but also I reaffirm the fact that it is incumbent on all of us as parties, as contributors to this process, to continue to prioritize this connection between human rights and climate action. And states will not only, if they do this right, states will not only be able to deliver better against the Paris Agreement, but also safeguard the human rights as they adapt to the impacts of climate change along the way. And that can only work if everyone's voice is heard. So we look forward to working with you all on the path to COP26. And before that, we look forward to hearing your views today as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Young, for presenting what the United Kingdom and other stakeholders are putting in place to reach the level of ambition needed to implement the Paris Agreement and the importance of an inclusive process. The last guest in our first segment is Pavan Mudlay, the Executive Director of Natural Justice, one of the organizations convening the event today. Mr. Mudlay, we would like to hear from you what is a human rights-based approach key in climate action from the perspective of communities directly impacted. What are the key civil society organizations' requests for COP26 with regards to human rights and climate change? And also what more could be done by UN human rights institutions to contribute to the protection of the rights of communities at the front lines in the context of climate change. Mr. Moodley, you have 5 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you, Diana. Just to start with a couple of things. I think to say firstly that the equation is quite simple when it comes to climate change and human rights. On the one hand, we have a right to life. And looking at our current trajectory with the 6th mass extinction, that right is threatened. We have a right to live with dignity. And if you look at the current ongoing ecocide, there's a mass violation of people's rights and the destruction of the ecosystem and biodiversity. So it's quite clear why there's a link, between the two. Now, the key thing here is the question of climate justice, because, this has been brought up in many of the COPs and has been spoken about in different forums and so on. But understanding what climate justice actually means, because the reality is, we're not dealing with a future scenario, as other speakers have said. People's lives are being impacted on now. And that question of, the injustice between, perpetrators and people that are polluting and destroying the planet, and those that are having to deal with the impacts of those while contributing, very little in proportion, is something, that continuously has to be on every agenda until, that there's some kind of shift in terms of not just the narrative, but what that actually means in practice. I think what COVID is showing us is that, the world is massively unequal, as we know. And with climate change, those inequalities will continue to increase. So COVID is really holding up a mirror, and what it's showing us is that when it comes to the crunch, people with resources will do what they need to do. So if you look at vaccines, people will stockpile vaccines. People will, ensure protection of a few people. When most people across the globe are left to their own devices. And so I think we can take a leaf out of the book of COVID, knowing that that scenario is not going to shift, because that's a level of injustice and that's the level of inequality that we live with. Now, the other aspect is that people, as we know, are fast losing faith with governments and government's ability to protect people's rights and the planet. And so more and more people are, being frustrated, feeling, a sense of hopelessness because of, what the reality on the ground is. So on the one hand, there's a big push for net zero emissions. At the same time, I mean, if you just take some of the cases on this continent in Africa, the coal case in Lamu, the East Africa oil pipeline between Uganda and Tanzania, the east coast of Southern Africa with South Africa, Mozambique, the Okavango Delta. There's an acceleration of fossil fuel extraction on this continent. Now that, again, the map doesn't tally in that sense. So, for me, the big question is, where's the accountability in all of this? Why are people, including governments and perpetrators of this, not being held accountable? And ultimately, if with the upcoming COP, with any of the other UN processes, if that accountability is not there, then we're certainly heading for or continuing on that pathway to disaster, because we do know it's big money behind a lot of the big projects. Now, in terms of indigenous and local communities, a lot of people are linked to the land. It's, livelihood, it's a matter of survival. And when people get displaced because of mining, big projects, land grabs for large scale agriculture and so on, people continue to become more and more vulnerable. And so one cannot ignore all of those different intersections between climate change and all of the other kind of social issues, because if we don't do that and don't do it effectively, then certainly we will not be addressing climate change on the head. There's a fair amount of work that we've done looking at the intersection between land tenure and people's ability to adapt, for example, to climate change, and showing that the more people have some link to the land in terms of tenure, the greater their abilities to take care of the land, but also to adapt to climate change. Women comprise a high percentage of people in many of these communities that have additional stresses and burdens, and that needs to be looked at specifically on a range of fronts, including looking at loss and damage, including looking at community and especially women's ability to deal with the consequences of climate change. Now, a rights-based approach creates an environment that allows communities to participate more effectively in decisions that affects them. So just listening to Archie now, that's absolutely critical. Not just within the COP space, but in all of the processes leading up, to climate negotiations and other UN processes. But there has to be, again, that nexus between the ability and the opportunity to participate, but linking that back to what's happening on the ground, so that the conversations are not disconnected from that kind of reality. So just to end off by saying, some of the big asks, and I'm part of this the COP president's designate advisory group on civil society and youth. And part of the things we are discussing and certainly pushing forward is around looking at issues of compensation and redress mechanisms, looking at indigenous and traditional knowledge, because that's going to be one of the pathways we really need to look hard at in terms of finding the kind of solutions, and pushing hard to stop the financing of fossil fuels, to ensuring effective remedies, and communities' ability to be able to adapt, and certainly in terms of loss and damage, looking at pushing on that frontier as well. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Pavan, for your strong messages and also for bringing nature in this session. We would like to follow up on the statements we heard with a few questions to our three last panelists. Let's start with the Marshall Islands ministers that with us, but we have with us Tina Stedge, who is a climate envoy for the Republic of the Marshall Islands. And we would like to continue the discussion with her and ask, in the follow-up of what Mr. Billimon mentioned in his remarks and of what we heard from the other interventions, how can human rights institutions support and enhance climate ambition and human rights-based climate action? Ms. Stedge, over to you. You have 1-2 minutes.
Thank you so much for having me join all of you today. It's really my privilege. Minister Billimon, it's about the middle of the night in the Marshall Islands. And so I'm stepping in for him, but also I want to recognize our Ambassador de Broom and our Geneva mission. The Marshall Islands joined the HRC just last year, and it's really been a strong advocate, and the work that they're doing out of that office is really quite engaged, and we've really been able to do quite a lot, I think, in a short amount of time. So I think, for the Marshall Islands, climate change really presents an existential threat. As a low-lying atoll nation, we're just 2 meters above sea level. When I'm at home, I can see the lagoon and the ocean pretty much on either side if you're standing in the middle of the island. And so we're truly on the front line of this climate crisis that threatens human rights. But for us, that includes the right to self-determination, just the very right to be. The rallying cry from the Pacific 1.5 to stay alive, it's more than a rallying cry. It's sort of front and center in our minds as we try to respond to the impacts of climate change. While we're on the front line, we also know that climate change knows no boundaries, and emissions in one part of the world results in global warming whose consequences affect us all. And I think that's very clear, particularly in the last 5 years, but certainly over the course of our experience, our collective experience with COVID, the connections that we see and that we have on this planet. So this recognition requires action and past time for action, in fact. And it's also past time to establish a mechanism that's focused on the intersection of climate change and human rights. Now more than ever, we need a stronger human rights-based approach to climate change at the Human Rights Council, but also across the various multilateral processes where discussions on climate change take place. And it's for that reason that the Marshall Islands is strongly advocating for, first, that the HRC lends a greater recognition to the transnational impacts of climate change and therefore human rights. And we feel that this can be done, for example, by addressing major gaps, in particular accountability of transnational, for example, transnational corporations and financial institutions. This could be done through the HRC's working group on transnational corporation and human rights, but also in specialized agencies. As Minister Billimon mentioned, for example, the Marshall Islands has been championing a carbon levy on shipping at the International Maritime Organization. And folks in this session might not know that the Marshall Islands is the third largest shipping registry in the world. So we're advocating for a levy in an area that will impact us directly financially, but we see the greater good for the planet and for our country in making that kind of measure, in taking that kind of stance in the IMO. And we think that similar measures could and should be taken around international aviation. Secondly, we have to ensure that parties to the UNFCCC secure ambitious outcomes at COP26. As we've heard from Archie and others, there must be a coherence between the negotiations that will take place there, in particular around discussions around guidance on carbon markets and loss and damage. And on guidance for carbon markets, we must secure an outcome that ensures environmental integrity. And then finally, to this new mandate for a special rapporteur on human rights and climate change. We really believe that that is a key piece of this international puzzle. A dedicated special rapporteur would give communities like ours on the front line of the climate crisis the chance to have the threats to our rights understood and addressed by the international community. In the Marshall Islands, we are incorporating human rights, a human rights approach to both mitigation and adaptation measures. But without the partnership and support of the international community, our ability to implement those measures is really a question mark. And we are pushing and working hard, even despite COVID. We were one of only 13 countries to submit an adaptation communication last year. And we continue to work, people on the ground just working flat out to make some of the adaptation decisions that we will have to make, which will be very terrible decisions, essentially. I mean, if you think about, Provin talked a little bit about the ties to land. We're looking at not necessarily having the land that, you know, is our heritage, and thinking about ways to perhaps have to elevate. That's in the longer term. In the shorter term, just surviving the most, successive droughts. Those are the things that we're having to deal with now. And also just envisioning what the future will be like for us that are quite difficult. And we are doing that work, but we need the support of the international community. And we certainly look to the HRC, and we hope a new special rapporteur for climate change and human rights to elevate this issue across all international fora and show how climate change and human rights intersect. And so with that, I just want to again say thank you, Komodada, to all of those here for having this discussion and for, pushing for progress in every way that we can. Komoe.
Thank you, Ms. Stage. Thank you also for reminding at the beginning of your intervention the important work the permanent missions do from Geneva to raise the concerns you mentioned. Let me now move to Mr. Young. From your perspective, Mr. Young, what opportunity does the next week's climate and development meeting offer to promote this human rights-based approach action? Recognizing the unprecedented challenges faced this year, could you tell us more about the presidency's vision to ensure that COP is the most inclusive ever held, as offered by Minister Sharma, for example, concerning measures to overcome financial and health barriers to participation at the conference? Over to you.
Thank you. Well, yes, and I'm very happy to say more about that. There's quite a lot in your question. First of all, when it comes to the Climate and Development Ministerial next week, I think that really by, like I said, focusing ministerial attention at this point in the year on practical action, on some of the issues that were identified, not simply by us by random, but were identified as a result of consultations with a broad range of parties, but also civil society organizations and other constituencies, that those highlighted that there were these 4 issues that really needed more attention paid to them, like I mentioned: responding to climate impacts, access to finance, the quantity, quality, and composition of finance. So those issues really need to be addressed urgently. In developing the summit, we have had roundtables, which were workshops hosted by and organized by civil society organizations, deliberately aiming for broad representation from Global South as well as Global North, balance in terms of male and female. We have engaged also with representatives of other constituencies and also members of the Indigenous Peoples Caucus. And those have come up with recommendations which have been discussed at ministerial roundtables, and then from those senior official roundtables through to ministerial roundtable next week. So hopefully it's not perfect, but hopefully, the way that we are developing that ministerial, as well as the outcomes that will flow from it, can both be positive for the inclusion of people from across the world in this process, as well as on the inclusivity of climate action. What I would say, though, is that we are facing an interesting context when it comes to continuing the work virtually between now and COP. So we are clear that COP26, our continued planning assumption is that it will be in person in November in Glasgow, and that is what we are working towards. But in order to get there, we need to hear from and engage voices from around the world. And we are not able to do that in the normal way. So we have not had a formal negotiating session since December 2019 in Madrid. But we have had some informal exchanges of views, and whether that's the June Momentum or the UNFCCC climate change dialogues. And what we have found through that is a mixed picture. We have found that there are some real concerns about connectivity, around time zone management, and around coordination. We have found that some groups and some parties and some institutions have felt that it has been harder for them to engage in an inclusive way. But we have also heard the opposite. We have heard some saying that actually by conducting some of this work virtually, it has made it more inclusive. It has made us better able to have voices heard from around the world. To take one example, there was a meeting on agriculture in November, which probably, if it had taken place in person in Bonn, wouldn't have had a full room. But actually online, we were able to have experts from around the world who wouldn't have traveled to Bonn for one meeting, quite rightly so, but were able to fully participate in a meeting virtually, and therefore actually you had greater plurality of views. So that is one of the challenges that we are trying to work through, is how do we get this balance of inclusivity virtually in the run-up to COP, But then also, I'm sure there'll be some positive lessons we can learn for the COP itself, so that it can be inclusive both in terms of what is done in person, but also more inclusive in terms of bringing voices from around the world in, learning lessons from events like this, and how we can do things virtually. One thing I would just add, though, is a point that Pooven made, which I think is really important, which is about really helping to translate the kind of the good intentions and the commitments into what does that mean in terms of practical inclusion on the ground. And it's important that strong commitments are made, whether that is on climate or whether that is inclusivity. But it's also vital that actually all parts of society help to enable and facilitate the better translation of that, so that they are not just words on a page, but they are fully realized when it comes to practical action. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Before we move to the next part, we have a last question to Pooven that we picked actually from the Q&A. This question, it was raised by Rebecca Thyssen. What opportunities do you see to integrate the recovery and the recovery plans in the international climate conversation? Pooven, over to you.
Thank you so much for that question. I think, firstly, a big interrelation. As I said earlier, what we've been asked for is to kind of look in the mirror. And I think there's several things here that, in terms of opportunities. I think, many economies that have been decimated, through COVID and are looking at recovery. I think more and more governments are starting to understand that, it makes economic sense, to shift from fossil fuel to clean energy. As one part of rebuilding economies, as one part of doing a just kind of energy transition. The challenge is using the same model, because it's people with big capital, multinational companies that would easily take up that sector, and people get left behind again. So, looking at different models where communities have a stake in clean energy as just one example. Because, as the science asks us to do, we have to do something fundamentally and radically different. And I think now's the time and now's the opportunity, as we look to recovery, to ensure some of those kind of transitions are happening. But at the same time, I think looking at some of the pitfalls in the sense of, not ensuring the same violations, whether it's mining for renewables, as an example, isn't a repeat of what's been happening before. And I think there's a lot of things we can learn from there. But I do want to end off, on the point around environmental and land defenders. Because, with the acceleration of some of these projects across Asia, Africa, I sat on a People's Tribunal with Indonesia recently, and just looking at the decimation in some ways, and people being under attack, or just before New Year's, defenders in Philippines, killed, or here in South Africa where I am, defenders every other day are under attack, and there've been, recent killings as well. And really calling upon, all of the different structures to ensure, and different governments, the finalization of the policy on the protection of environmental and land rights defenders, but to ensure there's proper implementation mechanisms. And ultimately, again, it's governments that need to be held accountable, to make this happen. So I think it's time to continue to increase the pressure to ensure these obligations under international law are certainly met, and where they're not met, that the spotlight is thrown on people that are perpetuating the violence and the killings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pooven. And it's now time to conclude this first part and move to the second part. So we are now starting the expert panel. And the first speakers in this expert panel have participated in 3 workshops that were held in the past weeks within the framework of the Geneva Dialogues on Climate Change and Human Rights. We will hear from the three first experts in this panel, key challenges and opportunities identified in these workshops. And we will continue introducing the speakers as they take the floor. And you can access their titles and biographies in the chat, as we mentioned at the beginning of this event. And may I also remind our experts that as we will have a second round of questions, and then as we are running out of time, I could invite them to be as succinct as possible, as they will have the opportunity to speak in the second time. And let me start with Astrid Puentes, who is the co-executive director of IDA, the Inter-American Association for Environmental Defense. Ms. Puentes, you are reporting back on the key challenges and opportunities of the workshop that addressed environmental racism. You have 3 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I will try to be very brief. On the challenges, there are 7 points that I wanted to highlight. The first one on environmental racism is that this is an old problem, and today it's positive that at least it has more visibility, but definitely the challenge is how to make sure that solutions are actually implemented. It was talked about how racism in a lot of ways is the elephant in the room on both the UN and the human rights world, and also how to challenge, because there's a lot of consequences of these colonial systems and even in the processes. One other challenge that was highlighted is the reductionists, which is prevents to tackle the scope of the problem that is very complex. So we cannot solve a problem that is very complex with either simple or just reduce this as a final or simple way to solve. Part of that, as was mentioned, was part of false solutions, including greenwashing or thinking about climate action. Now that we're thinking about the COP, how sometimes corporate actions are implemented without actual accountability, even including in the UN FCCC and the COPs and all of that influence, and how important it is to really include and advance on responsibility. The other element that I want to highlight is the challenge on representation and actual inclusion of different voices and diverse voices at the different UN levels, and especially on decision-making processes, and definitely also on regional and national spaces. As it was mentioned before as well in the workshop, it was highlighted also the high risk of people that is defending in general human rights, and particularly protecting the environment and climate. And this is definitely something that is a challenge that we need to advance, because we see that in the ground there is still a very acute situation. There's also a lot of challenges, including funding and actions for advances and actually be part of decisions. More specifically about the UN spaces, it was highlighted also the challenge of disconnection and lack of coordination, sometimes from either special rapporteurs or also agencies and agendas. So definitely making sure how we advance there is key. And the fact that a lot of meetings are in English, and how the processes are, it makes very difficult sometimes for communities and people to participate. The last challenge that I want to mention is on reparations. There's a lot of around this that was mentioned before, so I just want to make that there. And thinking about opportunities, there are many. Just to summarize, there's definitely the opportunity and the need to decolonize all systems and situations and institutions, and also approach with a systemic way, so that it is not only isolated, but really the solutions to consider intersectionality and a systemic approach to make sure that there's actual inclusion of different voices. We talk about also how at the UN there's a need to be more to coordinate better and to include different voices, including as a simple thing as making sure that meetings like this one and others are also providing translation, because it's not only about the technical part of it, but it's actually giving the opportunity for people to speak in our own languages and bring their voices there. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Ms. Puentes. And also it's the occasion for us to thank the interpreters working behind the scenes, and to remind to our speakers to speak when possible slowly, so that the interpreters can do efficiently their work. So proceeding with our expert panel, we will now hear from Lucy Moulenke, the Executive Director of the Indigenous Information Network. Ms. Moulenke will report on the key challenges and opportunities identified in the Indigenous Peoples Workshop organized in the run-up to this event. Ms. Moulenke, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for the good presentation so far and some of the key issues that have come up. I'll just add to what Puven has spoken, because he was also one of the speakers, and actually most of the points that were brought, challenges that were brought, he's already mentioned them. And one of the key examples that I want to mention here is that when we started our meeting, we started with a good example where a video was streamlined to kind of tell us and show us examples of how Indigenous communities and Indigenous people in general face a lot of issues when it comes to land issues. And this was a video about the Ogiek community, who have been struggling for over since 2017, struggling to have their land back. And they did quite, over 20 years, they really struggled at the domestic level. And then for 8 years, they also struggled at the regional level, and they were able to have their case, already recognized and given the right to have their land. But so far, they have not that right, because their own country have not approved it, and they are still continuing with the struggle. So that's a good example that we really wanted to share. And the Ogiek case is not the only one. I'm sure there are many other cases within the region of Africa. And as we had already, we have quite some big challenges when it comes to large scale projects that come in, agriculture, extractive industries, infrastructure, and projects that kick out and displace Indigenous people. And I think Puven had really clearly informed them. And those challenges of kicking and displacing Indigenous people, they really impact also on their on their life, because they lose their own traditional knowledge, they lose their cultures, and they actually just become displaced and even lose their own language. And therefore they just feel like they're people who are living in different lands that don't belong to them. And we also got quite some other big challenges that were brought up, and especially from discussion and presentation from Kenya also, where we were told that despite the fact that we have good laws, especially the Land Tenure Act and Community Land Acts, but those were good at the beginning when especially the Community Land Act was really put in place. But later on, it became a problem. And those tenure issues continue, really bringing a lot of complication to many Indigenous peoples, because they are not respected. And so we see that this discussion is continuing. And the other big other challenge that came up is the issue of the prior informed consent. And when we have all these challenges that are put down on displacement and large scale projects coming into community land and also to the Indigenous people's land, the communities are not actually consulted, Indigenous people are not consulted. And they say the issue of free prior informed consent is very, very important. And at the same time, despite that we are having these issues of land, the issue of climate change came in. And also the climate change, the problems that is caused by the same activities that are being undertaken within the lands. Already the Indigenous people in different countries live in, especially in Africa, live in this very fragile environment which was clearly explained by Povin. So it's very, very important to make sure that at least we pick up some of those challenges. We have examples from Philippines, where again, the issue of land, the issue of resources, natural resources that are held by indigenous people. And in the Philippines, for example, the conflict even they have, the issue of self-determination is not even respected at all. And this is one of the biggest challenges that was there, despite the fact that we talk about the human rights and about the FPIC, that we really want to make sure that we uphold it and try to get the institutions, human rights institutions, to really look at these particular challenges that we have and see how the parties to the Convention on Climate Change can be able to really respect the FPIC and human rights for indigenous people. There are also some other issues that were brought in that needs to be discussed very effectively, issues of energy, because they impact on the degradation of our lands. They also impact on the right to have that free energy, to be able to have the energy that is green and that is able to help communities not really distract their lands in trying to get themselves some energy to cook and to also to do other things. And of course, we know how the large scale projects bring up this issue. So we have these issues that are really problematic, but we hope that we can be able to get the recommendations that we have already had and share them out with you in our documents, so you can be able to forge forward for the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mulenkay. As mentioned in the chat, it is indeed a challenge to summarize a so rich discussion, conversation in only 3 minutes. We will now hear from Joy Chowdhury, Program Coordinator for network-wide projects at ESCRnet, the International Network for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. I hope I got the acronym right. Ms. Chowdhury will report back on the challenges and opportunities identified in the redress workshop that took place yesterday. Ms. Chowdhury, over to you.
Thanks, Diana. At the workshop yesterday, we touched on the role of courts, United Nations treaty bodies, national human rights institutions, as well as other human rights institutions, which have, within the extent of their respected powers, been engaging in different, often innovative ways on matters at the intersection of climate change and human rights. In terms of litigation to secure adequate redress for climate harms, several challenges are raised, including difficulties establishing causation, lack of access to attribution science, particularly in developing countries, lack of standing, high costs, implementation challenges, and so on. Also explored was strategic considerations in relation to who are we aiming to hold accountable through courts, states, yes, but also corporate actors, and tactical approaches in terms of choice of forum. One of the most pressing questions and remedies raised was how to craft remedies which will result in actual justice for communities, how to take the lead from communities. On engagement with UN treaty bodies and national human rights institutions, a lot was discussed, but a couple of key takeaways were submitting parallel reports to UNTBs can be valuable. Pronouncements then by UNTBs on state obligations on climate can be used to support national litigation. On NHRIs, participants stressed what NHRIs lack in enforcement powers, they can make up for in innovation and transnational collaboration. One of the thematic areas that was really stressed was that of loss and damage, an area which has huge implications for human rights. Article 8 of the Paris Agreement, which deals with loss and damage, does not involve or provide a basis for any liability or compensation as per para 51 of the decision adopting the Paris Agreement. Participants stressed the urgent need to address this constraint in terms of securing adequate redress. How might a strategy for this look like at COP26, and how might human rights institutions support with this? And more broadly, loss and damage encompasses past, present, and future harm, and engenders call for reparations and for redistributive justice. These calls may be dismissed as beyond legal redress. So what is the role of human rights institutions to shift that dialogue and show us how to address past wrongs? And to wrap up, there were a few broader questions and reflections as well. The analysis of the intersection of climate change and human rights is well articulated, but it does not yet resonate beyond a small circle of actors. And for us to promote adequate redress that resonates widely and goes beyond normative developments, it is essential to further raise awareness and build capacity amongst rights holders and also amongst decision makers as well at all levels. And a great effort on this front is being led by a coalition of NHRIs via mutual learning sessions in the run-up to COP26. And as a final point, it was raised that what is the significance of even ideal outcomes in individual cases and country contexts where development first, for example, is the overarching narratives, or dominant modes of production and consumption continue? So how can we think creatively about these issues to secure adequate redress for climate harms in more systemic ways? Thanks. Sorry, Diana, if I ran over a bit.
No, thank you, Joy. It was perfect. Moving on with the discussion, it is now a great pleasure to turn to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, Mr. David Boyd. Mr. Boyd, you have heard the introductory messages of this event and the key challenges and opportunities identified in the workshops organized in the context of the Geneva Dialogues on Human Rights and Climate Change. We would like to hear from you how can we ensure that special procedures are accessible for frontline communities and can best address their concerns, and also how can UN mandate holders contribute effectively to better climate action in order to prevent harms related to climate inaction? Over to you.
Thanks, Diana. Good morning, everybody from Canada. I think the most important thing we can do in terms of frontline communities is to hear their voices and amplify their voices. So it's terrific to have my friends from the Marshall Islands as a key part of the session today. When I was first appointed as Special Rapporteur in 2018, I made it a conscious decision that my very first country visit would be to Fiji, because I want to witness firsthand the devastating impacts of climate change on frontline communities. And that was a life-changing and very powerful, moving experience. My second country mission was to Norway, where I met with indigenous people in the Sami people in northern Norway. And both in Fiji and Norway, I met with people whose lives have been turned upside down by climate change, whether it's reindeer herders in Norway whose traditional livelihoods are under dire threat, or communities that had to be relocated in Fiji because of climate change. I've also hosted regional forums with young people and children around the world to hear their voices, and my commitment to them is to amplify those voices. And what they say to me consistently is, we've had enough talk, we need more action. In terms of frontline communities, one of the challenges that special procedures have is we only can do 2 country visits every year. And so, of course, we have to do outreach using the internet, using all of the other means at our disposal, and working with partners is critical. So, for example, I'm working with FIAN International to have a session in April with small-scale farmers from around the world. The other part of this question was about how can mandate holders ensure effective climate action. And many of my colleagues have produced excellent reports. My predecessor, John Knox, did an excellent report on climate change and human rights. I've posted a link to my report on climate change and human rights in the chat box. The Special Rapporteur on Culture and Human Rights, the Right to Culture, Karim Benoun, did an excellent report. The Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, Philip Alston, did an outstanding report, really calling upon everyone to do a little bit less talking and to do a lot more action. And the key thing to recall here is that these agreements like the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, their Achilles heel is that they lack enforcement mechanisms. And that's why human rights are so important, because human rights plus international environmental law equals accountability, as we saw in the Urgenda decision. So I think we all need to make sure that a rights-based approach to climate action is integrated in the Universal Periodic Review. It's a focus of national human rights institutions. It's a focus of treaty bodies. And I have to emphasize, my final comment here is that all of these international mechanisms, we're doing everything we can, quite frankly. The burden has to be on the states. I sent a letter to 193 states in January of this year, urging them to integrate human rights into their nationally determined contributions. I've received 2 responses to those 193 letters. So the burden is upon states to do better. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. We will now continue the discussion with Vasilka Santin, a member of the Human Rights Committee, to whom we would like to ask how can human rights treaty bodies best address issues that are getting increasingly urgent, such as environmental racism, access to redress, etc., which are also relevant to rights protected by the core international human rights instruments? And are there opportunities to strengthen synergies between the work of the human rights treaty bodies and that of other governance actors and institutions? Over to you. You are muted. Vasilka, you are muted.
Can you hear me now? Does it work now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you again for inviting me to this very important event, and congratulations to the organizers for organizing it. Now going straight to the questions in the interest of time, I think one of my general remarks would be that I think treaty bodies should switch the approach when thinking of the interconnectedness of the climate change and human rights from a more usually reactionary one, because treaty bodies are mostly engaging when there is alleged violations or manifestly occurring violations in a state party, to a more preventative one. So guiding the state party's conduct in order that rights are being respected and ensured in line with the demands of addressing the climate change. And I would have three main thoughts on that. First, considering the three main functions of the treaty bodies, so monitoring of the implementation, issuing of the decisions based on individual complaints, and the issuance of the general comments or recommendations, I think that while the individual decisions, so the views on individual complaints are of very great importance and can provide significant guidance on needed action of a particular state party, with also the possibility of wider application for other state parties and international community at large, as was the case with the Human Rights Committee's decision last year in the case of Mr. Teitoita versus New Zealand. We also need to take into account significant backlogs and consequent delays. These days, it takes about 8 years for the case to get processed and decided upon by the Human Rights Committee, which is far too long, both for individuals concerned and also for effectively tackling climate change concerns. So thus, while recognizing the important contribution of treaty bodies jurisprudence, which adds to the national and regional climate change litigation, this avenue is at the core of a reactionary nature, which only has a limited preventative function. So thus, I think that it is of utmost importance to systematically focus the attention of treaty bodies to climate change in regular dialogues with state parties through the periodic monitoring to contribute and guide their actions in adopting necessary adaptation and mitigation laws, policies, and actions in line with their basic human rights obligations. This is being increasingly done through inclusion of special climate change issues in list of issues and list of issues prior to reporting. And in case of the Human Rights Committee, especially in relation to the right to life and in relation to the general comment number 36 that was already mentioned, but also through raising questions on climate change and environmental issues when discussing other issues or rights, including on corruption, freedom of expression, rights of vulnerable groups, minorities, indigenous peoples. And I think what should continue to be highlighted is the importance of inclusivity, access to information, and participatory rights of all relevant stakeholders when decisions impacting the environment and consequently human rights are being adopted. And further and last on this first question, in the spirit of creating necessary preventative tools, I think that it would be worth investing in developing general comments and recommendations on issues of intersections of human rights with climate change. And that not only in individual treaty bodies, but actually in cooperation among various treaty bodies to share the views and experience across the treaty bodies when preparing such general comments on or recommendations. I think the state parties would greatly benefit from such guidance in these unpredictable times. So are there any possibilities for synergies? Yes, I think there certainly are. I think that the UN being present in the majority of the countries across the globe with its field offices are the obvious actors who are well placed to disseminate the work of the treaty bodies. and could also be a powerful force to make sure that the human rights considerations are actually integrated into state parties' actions so that we really achieve the real implementation on the ground. Further, I think that the human rights and climate change is currently too compartmentalized between technical experts and treaty body experts, and therefore it would be beneficial to join forces and brought these efforts together. So information sharing and coordination are thus key to strengthen these synergies. And also, I think more could be still done also by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to contribute to awareness raising and dissemination of what treaty bodies recommend on climate change, both within the UN family with various departments, but also specialized agencies, as it was mentioned earlier, as well as to communicate it to the general public. Thank you very much on these two issues for your
Thank
attention.
you, Mrs. Sansin. And before I turn to our next expert, let me also mention that the questions that our guests have been raising in the Q&A have been replied directly there, as we are a little bit struggling with time. And there are also important links and remarks made in the chat of this event. Our next expert is, so the discussion continues with Didier Georges from IT's permanent mission to the United Nations in Geneva, to whom we are asking how can states best make use of the universal periodic review process to promote addressing the human rights effects of climate change? And what are the barriers to implementation of relevant universal periodic review recommendations? And what are good practices for facilitating their implementation? And also, if I may, how can states facilitate involvement of environmental civil society organizations and affected communities in these UPR processes? If you could be as short as possible, that would be great. Thank you. Over to you, Didier.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Just setting up my timer so I don't go on over time. Perfect. So yes, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I have 3 minutes. We're under the gun, so I'll jump right to it. How can states make best use of the UPR process? To actually use it, doing my research, I found that actually a very small number of states actually make climate change recommendations and human rights at the UPR. For example, I can give you the statistics. During the first cycle, climate change was mentioned 29 times. During the second cycle, it was mentioned 67 times. And already into the third cycle, we've made progress. It's been mentioned 160 times. Now, who are the countries actually talking about climate change at the UPR? The countries that are making recommendations on climate change are actually countries from the Climate Vulnerable Forum in small and developing states. We're talking about Vietnam, the Philippines, Maldives, Fiji, and of course, well, not of course, but on the list is my own country of Haiti, which places great importance to human rights. But funny enough, the countries receiving recommendations on climate change at the UPR are all small and developing states. That's Fiji, Kiribati, Vanuatu, Tuvalu, and Nauru. So we're at the UPR, it's kind of like an echo chamber where climate vulnerable countries and also small developing states are talking to other climate vulnerable countries, small developing states about climate change. And also the big emitters, or also the big players, are seeing this as less of a priority at the UPR. So for my recommendation to the first question would be, we need to encourage our colleagues and also other states to make a lot more recommendations on climate change, not just small and developing states, but also to the big emitters as well. This will prove that the climate change is a priority for all governments around the world. It also, what's more important is actually, and at least, sorry, that was mixed up my notes there for a second. Second question is the barriers to implementation. Since almost all countries, the majority of almost all countries have been small and developing states receiving recommendations on climate change, the implementations of those are very hard to actually quantify. Primarily because there have been challenges of the financials, of course, and of course, another part is that there are many players involved in terms of actually what goes on the ground. We're talking about governments, parliaments, NGOs, bilateral partners, business and local community. So to really have action on the ground on these issues, and with governments and states are already facing financial barriers, and this is even prior to COVID-19, it's a really small, it's a really big task to access small and developing states. So of course, my country has received recommendations on climate change. We made many recommendations on climate change, and we always try to include to small and developing states and other countries made them to of course work with national community, work with bilateral partners, and also work with the Office of the High Commissioner on this. The last question is, how can states better facilitate environmental CSOs? And that's usually to include them in the process of the UPR. The UPR takes place every 4 years. And of course, there's UPR Info, which I got into 6 that I mentioned above, has something called the UPR pre-sessions, where they actually come states to come and we talk to other NGOs actually on the ground about what's going on in certain states. And I think a lot more important needs to be placed at the UPR in every single pre-session and also every single UPR. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. George. We will now move to our last expert, Ms. Sanchita Hake, the Deputy Permanent Representative of Bangladesh to the United Nations in Geneva. Mrs. Hake, we would like to hear from you as a representative of a country exceptionally vulnerable to climate change. How can the Human Rights Council encourage UN human rights mechanisms to take up questions of climate change and human rights? And how can it incorporate and amplify these efforts? And also, what are effective measures for ensuring that actions taken and commitments made at the Council in Geneva are reflected in domestic policy and practice and in other international spaces like the climate conference later this year? Over to you.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. And I would also like to thank all the organizers for organizing this very important event. And it's indeed my pleasure to join this esteemed panel today. In fact, the Human Rights Council first addressed the interlinkages between human rights and climate change through the adoption of a landmark resolution, which is 7/23 in 2008. And since then, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and the Philippines have been tabling this resolution annually in the Council. Also, the Council's feedback to the UNFCCC process about the impacts of climate change on human rights was first recognized in the Cancun COP26, I think in 2010. Since then, we have undoubtedly come a long way, but still a lot more needs to be done. So let me make some specific points how the Council could provide further impetus to promote human rights and climate change agenda. First, you know that other than the human rights resolution, human rights and climate change resolution, there are relevant resolutions where the co-sponsors can consider suitably focusing one theme on climate impacts in those resolutions. This can be one way. Second, the UPR process, many panelists have referred to that. There can be a dedicated chapter on the climate actions of the country under review in their national report to the UPR. And also when the member states make recommendations to that country, they can also make recommendations on climate actions. The third point I would like to mention is that the HRC Advisory Committee, maybe this committee can be asked to research on the linkages between the SDG 13 and all other relevant SDGs from human rights perspectives. And there can be a tracking mechanism to help reach the SDG targets and indicators. The report might feed into the expert group meeting of the HLPF to help generate a desired momentum. And fourth, OHCHR could play a very critical role in building capacity of the countries to develop and implement nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement with a focus on impacts of climate change on human rights. And I would also like to highlight that the OHCHR may consider producing a report on how the transnational corporations and other key private actors have considered addressing the impacts of climate change in their business operations that eventually affect the enjoyment of human rights adversely, particularly. Now, nothing is effective until the impact of Human Rights Council's work reaches the national level. So in this regard, one way could be to enable the national human rights institutions to launch and maintain an ongoing dialogue with the national governments to act on climate change. Second, the national SDG coordinators, many countries have now SDG coordinators, they can be sensitized to link climate change and human rights more closely in the national policies aimed at the implementation of the SDGs. And the last point I would like to make is that the UN country teams also have a responsibility to complement the national efforts to address climate change in the context of its existing human rights policy and operational frameworks. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hake. And we want to apologize because we are, of course, running out of time, but we would like to conclude this second part of our event, the expert panel, with the last round of very short interventions from our experts. So to the three first experts who reported back on the workshops, we would like to ask what is one key development you would like to see in the context of climate governance at COP26 and human rights spaces? Could you be as short as possible, and also do not run, because interpreters it's very challenging for the interpreters if you are speaking too fast. And we could maybe start with Astrid Puentes. Over to you.
Thank you. If we can select one thing, is to make sure that during the next COP, their meetings are more inclusive and make sure that there's actual diverse voices, not only being invited, but actually heard in decision-making processes, and that this includes also better coordination between the UNFCCC and how that works, and also special procedures and UN treaty bodies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we can follow with Lucy Mulenke. Over to you. I'm looking at my screen. I don't see Lucy, so maybe we follow with Joy. Lucy, please go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry, I did mute myself. I think the most important thing is that we remind parties to the UN Convention on Climate Change that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that basic rights and fundamental freedoms are to be enjoyed by people, no matter who they are, where they live. It has to be, they have to be recognized. Everyone is entitled to fundamental dignity delivered by the foundation of freedom, justice, peace in the world. And therefore, for indigenous peoples, we have indigenous people scattered everywhere. And despite the fact that Archie Young, the main negotiator, has said that you'll include indigenous people, we also must say that the issue of looking at women, gender issues, and also to look at the future generation, the future community, that is the youth, and look at this very effectively and ask the member states to really make sure that they follow human rights. It's a human right-based approach that we promote, and that is exactly what we are, because they have signed the Paris Agreement. Indigenous people and local communities don't do that. So it's really our appeal that there has to be action. COP26 have to be participatory. Thank you.
Thank you. And let's move to Joy Chaudhuri.
Okay, yes, Emily, I will speak slowly. Very quickly, one development that I would like to see is better integration of climate and human rights discourse and action in the context of loss and damage, because there are openings this year in COP26. The human rights implications of loss and damage are staggering. There is a huge need for climate finance, and we do not see that coming through to communities. So ways that we can work together in synergy from the human rights world with the climate community taking advantage of openings at COP and moving beyond that as well will be really important, and with the leadership of affected communities who are at the front lines of this crisis and are also resisting the structural drivers of the crisis. So yeah, I'll stop here.
Thank you. And let's now move to our other four experts, and to whom we would like to ask what is the key developments you would like to see in the context of the Geneva-based human rights bodies engagement in climate action. And we will start by the Special Rapporteur, David Boyd.
Thanks, Diana. I would say, first of all, just echoing Joy, that it was 30 years ago that Vanuatu proposed a loss and damages mechanism. It was 13 years ago that the Maldives proposed an air passenger travel levy, which at $10 per flight would raise over $40 billion a year that could go to the small island developing states and the least developed countries. Not one penny has changed hands from wealthy countries to low income countries since those proposals were made for loss and damages. That is embarrassing. And the second thing I'll say is that the United Nations needs to recognize as soon as possible that everyone on this planet, everywhere, no matter the color of their skin, their religion, their gender, everyone has the right to live in a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, which includes a safe climate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Boyd. And we will now move to Ms. Sansin.
I hope you can hear me now.
We can.
Okay, I fully agree with what was said by Mr. Boyd, and in the context of the human rights treaty bodies, I think it's very important that we establish a regular two-way communication among all UN actors on climate change and human rights. So rather than boxing within our own boxing cages, I think we should strive to climb together this wall to tackle climate change. And also, I think it's very important to connect all the dots between the treaty body recommendations and effective implementation on the ground if you really want to make a real impact. What is recommended in Geneva should not stay in Geneva. I think that climate change is really taking the highway, and if treaty bodies as well as other institutions are trying to catch up by taking side roads and small roads, we will never get there. So I think if the secretariats and the treaty bodies really join forces, we will be able to make a much stronger push for action. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Sanchin. I'm now turning to Didier Georges, and if I could ask you, Didier, to really speak slowly, that would be great.
Yeah, sorry about that for the first time. I'll go as slowly as possible. I actually wrote this part. The first thing we ask is that more states, including the big emitters, make more recommendations on climate change and human rights. We need to get out of our echo chamber and really show that climate change is a priority for all states, including small island developing states and the big emitters. Second thing we would like to see is that a mechanism on climate change and human rights. With all respect to all special rapporteurs, from Haiti's point of view, this cannot be a one-person mechanism. It needs to be at least a team of 3 people. This would be more effective in fast-forwarding climate change at the center of the Human Rights Council. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. George. And we move now to Sanchita Hake for her last words.
I will be very brief, only to make 2 points. First of all is that the creation of a new mandate for climate change and human rights, we consider it to be very important because, you know, yes, we are aware that there is already a special rapporteur on climate change and environment, but climate change itself is such an important topic that deserves special attention and focused attention. And by creation a mandate, the awareness on this on climate change and its relation with human rights can be raised more. And there are, transnational impacts of climate change, and all these needs to be addressed, needs to be, paid attention. So only by the creation of a special rapporteur on climate change and human rights, this issue can be resolved. There are several countries who are opposing this on the excuse of scarcity of fund, but we think that the scarcity of funds should not be the hold us back on this important issue. And second point, which many other panelists have mentioned, particularly Joy Choudhury, that the loss and damage and the justice issue involved with this. In the COP25, those who followed, you know that there were some developments on this matter of loss and damage, but because of finance issue, we actually could not have much progress. So we would expect that in COP26, there would be some significant progress on this loss and damage issue. Only then the climate justice as a concept can really get our attention, because you have to remember that the countries like Bangladesh, they hardly had any contribution in climate change, but they are the ones who are paying the highest price for it. With this, I would like to finish my deliberations. Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hack. And so we can now move to the conclusion part of this event. And I have now the pleasure to introduce Sébastien Duchy from the Center for International Environmental Law, CIEL, who has been coordinating with his team and the other institutions co-hosting today's event, the Geneva Dialogues on Human Rights and Climate Change, and the session that brings us all here today. Sébastien, over to you.
Thank you very much, Diana, and I will take the opportunity to thank you, all of the other panelists, for all of the interventions, as well as the participants for the very thoughtful comments and questions that have been shared in the chat or through the Q&A function. It is the second time that we organize with the same organizers, and thanks to the support of Luxembourg, a Geneva Dialogue on Human Rights and Climate Change. And our hope is really actually to take stock of the progress that we are achieving, and also to give ourselves a 12-month timeline to make sure that we can come back and really actually hold each other accountable for the progress that is being made during those months, because we've heard that there is really no time to be lost, whether it's on the integration of human rights in climate action, the importance of using human rights to bridge this ambition gap, or the gap when it comes to international support. So we're very pleased with the high level of participation, and hope to see all of you again in 12 months to be able to assess the progress further. Without any additional words, I will simply give the floor to the two final panelists that will help us maybe reflect on the conversation that we have had today. It is my privilege to introduce first Dr. Ruth Katumuri, who is the Senior Director of Economic, Youth and Sustainable Development at the Commonwealth Secretariat. Dr. Katumuri, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Sébastien. Thanks for this opportunity to to be here and to listen, as well as contribute to this conversation. If I may, I'd like to just share a presentation so that it'll be easier to talk through faster. Can you see? Are you able to see the presentation?
Not yet.
Okay, it seems to be loading. Well, I can start speaking while it's loading. So the thing is that I want to reflect on right to sustainable development. And are you able to hear me?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, because the screen seems frozen. I'm having problems with we had a new laptop. The thing is that to reflect, and the conversations here, I don't want to pick one or two as the highlights. What I want to say is that all the points that were made with respect to indigenous populations and inclusion, all those are absolutely relevant and important. The point I would like to reiterate is that while we are all preoccupied with the crisis of health and economy, we should not forget and lose the progress we have been making with respect to climate change. And I think that's why this forum is very important, that it continues to advocate for the fact that we need to continue our progress on climate improving, on addressing challenges of climate change. So I just want to reflect in the right to sustainable development for all life. and the earth. So we have water, land, and biodiversity. But I just want to put 2 points out there. One is the right to clean air, because I think when the Paris Agreement came up, it was all the aspects of air pollution were not, data was not out that much at that time. So somehow I feel this is more important because we need to breathe, and if you can't breathe, there's no life as such. So this is why right to clean air, I think we have to put that very actively on the table. The other thing is right to equitable access to climate finance. So just going here, just to show here, the Paris Agreement and human rights conversations, that the headline is right to life, water, sanitation. But air is not here, so, whereas air is very, very important. And I think going forward, we should be putting air into the mix. I just want to, this is a work in progress. I cannot share this with you, but this is some of you may be aware of the Commonwealth Vulnerability Index. We are going to be launching the new one. It very clearly shows the vulnerabilities, small island states, as well as the vulnerability to climate change across. And it's like we're looking at data to 2018, and it really clearly highlights. So in that context, it is for us a context of our underpins everything we do with respect to a sustainable development. And I just want to quickly present what is it that the Commonwealth Secretariat is doing in the context of finance and biodiversity. For example, I'll briefly mention a few things. This one, and then we go here. Some of you may have heard about the Climate Finance Access Hub. This is our very important work that we are doing with member countries at request from them, enabling them to access global funds. And this is one of our flagship programs, which is facilitating this for our most vulnerable countries. The second thing I want to show very quickly is the other things we do is Common Sensing Program, Climate Action Enhancement Package, trying to meet the NDC through the NDC partnership. And one last thing, I would, so then we are, for the Shogam, which is forthcoming in June, we plan to launch the Living Lands, which is of course land and biodiversity. And some of you may already be familiar with our Blue Charter, which has been in place for some time. This champions, it's a charter which champions an action group. So I stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Katumuri, and I'm glad that we could see your presentation. Finally, I would like to give the floor to Ambassador Mark Bischler, who is both the Climate Change and Human Rights Ambassador for the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. And I take this opportunity to thank again Luxembourg for their support for these issues, not just for organization of such events, but also supporting such issues in relevant negotiations. The floor is you, Ambassador Bischler.
Thank you, Sebastian, and thank you also to Diana for friendly and effective moderation so far. Fair warning right from the start, 3 minutes concluding remarks will certainly not allow me to do justice to all the valid and pertinent remarks and suggestions that were made today by ministers, by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, by the distinguished representatives and the highly competent panelists, and apologies for that. Many thanks for their valuable input. The Geneva dialogues on human rights and climate change have become a privileged space in which to discuss two of our most urgent global challenges and to identify avenues to explore for further increased actions. So the organizers from the Office of the High Commissioner, from Ciel, Earth Justice and Natural Justice, therefore deserve our gratitude and our encouragement for their ongoing effort, and Luxembourg is indeed proud to support these efforts. Now, let me try to identify one or the other opportunity that are particularly relevant for states, the human rights, the United Nations human rights mechanisms and other stakeholders in order to step up their game. As a matter of fact, in order to step up our game in the time left, and more precisely during this year, 2021, that the Secretary General has qualified as a crucial year in the fight against climate change. I would dare to say that if 2021 is a crucial year for the fight against climate change, it is quite naturally also crucial for the fight for human rights, because both fights are intrinsically linked And we are not in an either-or scenario, of course. As a matter of fact, climate action and the promotion of human rights need to be integrated in order to be efficient, effective, and mutually reinforcing. To put it in more operational terms, as climate action policies and measures are defined, well, they should be designed so that their main objective will be to fulfill human rights. And one would think that since the powerful references to the protection and promotion of human rights, both in the Agenda 2030 and in the Paris Agreement from 2015, this understanding would have become conventional wisdom by now, at least at the level of states who, after all, are the signatories of these landmark international pacts. However, this is still not entirely the case, and as such represents an opportunity for states to follow suit. In doing so, states will be able to harvest the fruit of higher levels of policy coherence. Of course, the implementation of state policies will keep on requiring important financial means, but to be able to spend public funding with the knowledge and the assurance that it will serve two precious and highly sought after goals like viable climate conditions on the one side and the respect of human rights on the other side is not only a no-brainer in terms of public spending efficiency, it is also a valid sales pitch come the next general elections. Building a rights-based approach into climate policymaking allows for the type of double impact that states and political decision makers can no longer afford to ignore. And by the way, savvy private sector investors, who are another stakeholder group in the climate human rights discussion, these private sector investors have understood for some time now that doing well while doing good is no longer an empty promise. Responsible investment has indeed become the fastest growing segment in the overall investment universe, not least because of the triple bottom line of financial, social, and environmental benefit that it can generate. It is also due to ever more demanding ESG reporting requirements. So a real opportunity to grasp for younger generations of investors who tend ever more often to prefer a reasonable financial return coupled with positive social and environmental impact over damaging profit maximization. As an important stakeholder group, civil society organizations are playing a crucial role in awareness raising on these new options. Alongside member states, civil society organizations, including human rights defenders, of course, have become active interlocutors of and within the United Nations human rights mechanisms, be it in partnership with the Office of the High Commissioner, through contributions to the treaty bodies and in dialogue with the mandate holders of the special procedures. And while most of the human rights mechanisms have integrated climate change aspects into their work, it might be a worthwhile effort to explore the possibility of creating a position of a full-time special rapporteur on human rights and climate change, as mentioned by Minister Billimon from the Marshall Islands and Shanshita Haq from Bangladesh just a moment ago. In conclusion, allow me to express one or two wishes. First of all, I wish, for the sake of us all, that on December 31st, with the help of the human rights institutions, we can look back on an inspiring youth summit, look back on an effective pre-COP in Milan and a successful COP26 in Glasgow, with full operational tools from the Paris Agreement, renewed and increased national determined contributions, as well as a steady and a steadily swelling flow of climate finance and sustainable finance, but also, of course, adequate levels of accountability. Why do I wish for all of this? Well, because stepped up climate action will entail better protection of human rights. On December 31st, I also hope that we will be able to dare a more hopeful look onto the years to come, with higher climate justice, most notably for the LDCs and the small island development states, with higher levels of engagement from all sides for international cooperation based on a continued inspired leadership and a commitment for responsible management for our multilateral fora and tools. The rights that we claim are inherent to each and every human being. A livable climate is what we need for being human. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Bischler. And if everyone will bear with me for just the final minute for this event today, we've had such a rich conversation in so little time. I would like to pass the floor back to Sanchita Hake, who has asked to make a final point to conclude today's event.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, and I'm sorry to request for 30 seconds. In fact, I just wanted to inform all that at the initiative of Bangladesh, there was a joint statement which was made in the ongoing 46th Human Rights Council session on the creation of a special rapporteur on climate change and human rights. And I'm happy to report to you that around 60 countries from all regions of the world, they supported us and they joined this statement. So I would request through this event, Mr. David Boyd and others, and also the Geneva-based human rights bodies, NGOs and civil societies to push for this, request of us for creation of a special rapporteur. I thank you.
Thank you so much for this final word, Deputy Permanent Representative, and for bringing us back to what is happening just now actually at the Human Rights Council and the promising developments that we have seen over the last weeks. I will just conclude the event now to make sure that we can release you all to your very important work. I'd like to conclude by thanking the Office of the High Commissioner of Justice, Natural Justice, the Geneva Environmental Network, and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, as well as the interpreters who have supported this event today. And last but not least, the other members of our team at the Center for International Environmental Law, who have done a lot of work to put together this event, as well as the workshops organized previously. Also, we really look forward to continuing to work with all of you. And I think one of the key words that we took from this conversation is really the importance of joining forces, using all possible mechanisms, institutions, and really networking much more in order to build on each other's work, because the gaps that we are facing are daunting. So hopefully we can all reconvene in just a year time to reflect on the benefit of having achieved this global recognition of a right to a healthy environment for all, to reflect on the first steps by the potentially new special rapporteur on human rights and climate change that might be established in June, as Sanchita reminded us of, and as well as to reflect on positive developments at the COP26. And in the meantime, we really encourage you all to keep reaching out and cooperating with a broad range of stakeholders and actors. Thank you to all for your presence today, and we look forward to continuing on this very long road.
Thank you. Bye-bye.